Welcome to this session of AIJC 2020. Some quick housekeeping notes before we start. You see on your screen Roy Blumenthal, who is our resident sketchnoter and caricaturist. You'll see him at work, and from time to time you'll see a close-up of his work, and we will share it at the end of the session. For your questions, please use the Q&A function, and the facilitator will pick them up and pass them on. We need to keep to a strict time frame, so speakers, please stick to your time allocations. Have a great session.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this milestone session at the African Investigative Journalism Conference, looking specifically at LGBTQ issues and the challenges and also the possibilities of covering stories that have to do with sexual orientation and gender identity on the African continent. In the past decade, my name is Mark Gavissa. I should have introduced myself. I'm the author of a book that's just been published called The Pink Line: Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. In the past decade, the issue of LGBTQ rights has exploded, sometimes violently, onto the African scene, with the media playing a pivotal role, sometimes inciting hatred and sometimes providing much needed information. How does one report fairly and accurately on an issue that has been for so long underground and that provokes such strong reaction? What role does foreign support play? And is this a double-edged sword? Are attitudes changing? And what role does the media play in this? What risks do LGBTQ journalists and their subjects face in this challenging environment? Finally, why is the gay story such a good story? And if it is, how to tell it? I'm joined this afternoon by a really wonderful panel of journalists from across the continent who will explore these issues with me. We would love you to explore these issues too with us. Please feel free to write your comments in the chat section. And if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A through the Q&A function, and we will have some time at the end of the panel to discuss with you too. It would be really lovely to know who's on the panel too for us. So rather than talking into the ether, we would like to see you in some way. And the way to do this would be just to let us know in the chat function who you are and where you are tuning in from, so we have a sense of our audience. I will introduce the panel to you one by one as they begin their opening comments. And then from those opening comments, we'll go on to interrogate the issues a little bit more. So our first panelist is Johnson Mayamba, who's a Ugandan award-winning human rights journalist with over 10 years experience. He is an editor at the Daily Monitor, Uganda's most influential media house under the Nation Media Group, and has extensively reported about LGBTQ persons' rights in Uganda, specifically the anti-homosexuality bill, and the eventual murder of David Kato, who was an LGBTQ rights defender in Uganda. Now, Johnson, just before David Kato's murder, he was exposed along with 99 other quote unquote top homos in a very sensational newspaper headline of the paper, The Rolling Stone, that called for these top homos to be hanged. I wonder if you would kick off this conversation by describing the role that the media has played in fomenting homophobia in Uganda and in advocating for the Anti-Homosexuality Act. How, if at all, this has changed and what role journalists such as yourselves are trying to play to bring into the public discourse not only a measure of, of, um, of objectivity and fairness, but also the more accurate information about a community that has been so marginalized and reviled in Uganda. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark, and greetings everyone from wherever you're watching this from. Uh, like Mark has introduced, I'll be discussing the Ugandan context concerning the coverage of LGBTQI issues. To start with, as I share, to give you a context, the Anti-Homosexuality Act was introduced in Uganda in 2009, and it was codenamed Kill the Gay Bills, Kill the Gay Bill, because in its original form, it advocated for killing of aggravated homosexuals. However, when it was revised, it called for life imprisonment for repeated offenders and also 14 years for first offenders. The trigger in this point, of course, this wasn't the first case to appear before court, but this was the trigger. The LGBT community challenged the constitutionality of that section that is highlighted under the Equal Opportunities Commission Act that stopped the commission from investigating matters considered immoral, socially harmful, and unacceptable by majority. Of course, the High Court ruled in the community's favor on the basis of the right to hearing. What followed after that court ruling was the publication that you have mentioned, Mark, that is the owner of the newspaper, who came out to expose 100 top homosexuals in Uganda. That was the first edition. The second edition came with more faces and more profiles of such people. What followed after that in less than, in the next month, the community still went back to the court and challenged such publications on the basis of respect to privacy and dignity. The High Court ruled again in the favor of the community and said such publication violated fundamental rights to dignity and privacy, although the owners of the paper said they were getting rid of the criminals in the country by exposing them. In less than a month, David Kato was killed on 26 January in 2011. On the left is during his burial. On the right was when he was still alive. The person who killed him pleaded guilty and was jailed for 30 years in the same year, November 2011. In 2013, the gay bill was passed, and at the passing of the bill, the Speaker of Parliament said he was giving Ugandans a Christmas gift because, according to Han, other people who had voted for this bill said it was to protect Uganda's morality and future. In the following year, on February 24th, the president signed the bill, and the following day there was a rally by the opponents of the bill, and on the right, as you can see, there was a rally to thank the speaker, the proposer of the bill, and the president, and they said, "Thank you, Museveni, no change," meaning you deserve more terms in power. On the right, that following day, another tabloid, which is called Red Paper, published 200 faces of suspected homosexuals in the country. In April 2014, the LGBT community went back to the Constitutional Court to challenge the constitutionality of that act. And on 1st August, the Constitutional Court ruled that it was passed without quorum in Parliament, and so it was not a valid document to be among the law books. The following day, after the passing of after nullifying that act, the group that called themselves ex-homosexuals had a rally to influence the minds of the people against the sexual minorities community, that even when the court has said they can still go on, but the community cannot accept them. In 2019, there were also proposals to reintroduce the same act, and as a journalist who has been covering and following these issues, I wrote a story, as you can see, that challenged the validity of introducing such an act and the effect it would have on the community and also the general public. Of course, the bill was withdrawn and it has been shelved until further notice. Hopefully, it won't resurface anytime soon. Just to run quickly, what have been the challenges in covering this story on my side? There have been stigmatization both within the media fraternity and the public. You find even your fellow journalists would say that you're trying to promote something that is not accepted in the country. There have been also intimidation from the state, especially the police, where you receive calls and they tell you, why are you so stuck on that story? Why can't you leave it there? And there are other important issues that you need to cover. On the other side, also editorial policies that do not really favor coverage of such stories. As you can see, only 1/3 of all the stories are written concerning this topic. Only those that have been published, just 1/3, meaning that the majority of them have been crushed over time. On the positive side, also on the negative side, which is the challenge, is that it has led to the exposure of the LGBTQI community, especially the rights defenders, which is a double-edged sword, like you've seen. One led to the death of David Kato, but it has also given the visibility to the community that these people really exist. It's not just a blanket thing that we are discussing. On the positive side, I've received support from some members within with the colleagues within the community and also within the newsrooms. The attitudes are changing, especially when you get to the urban youth. They no longer take it as something that is really new, like they know that they're existent. And another opportunity that I see in this is that the area is underreported, so we need more people to get on board to report such stories. So how do we report such a story? First thing that you have to do that has helped me continue is that you have to stick to the basics of the profession. You have to be accurate, you have to be objective, you have to balance. These are the things that we are taught in journalism schools, and we don't need to dwell on them anymore. Second thing, we have to bear in mind that we are as a journalist, you are a messenger and not a judge. Your role is to give the public the information so that they can be informed and educated to make independent decisions, not for you to decide for them. Another thing we have to put in mind is that every person deserves dignity and respect, just like you do. Sexual minorities are not aliens. There are people within our community, that within families, within friends. So what would you do if you found out that your friend or your closest family is one of the sexual minorities? Would you advocate for the killing? I don't think it would be. Just to go quickly as I wind up, what support is more needed? Like I've said, we need to train more journalists, especially those who are willing to cover the subjects. We also need to support any efforts that aim at decriminalizing colonial laws that still existing on our colonial books. We need to speak up against any attacks that aim at stifling media freedom to fully protect human rights for everyone. Also, we need to push for editorial policies to change. For example, in Uganda, the Vision Group, which is a government-owned entity, has a policy, a verbal policy within the newsroom that they're not supposed to cover anything to do with sexual minorities in Uganda. The only stories that usually come out are aimed at promoting homophobia that is still existent within the society. On the lighter note, like it was mentioned, that was 2016 when I was recognized as one of the best human rights reporters in Uganda, not only for the LGBT community, but for the rights of everyone I cut across. So it is not an area that is supposed to be shunned. We are supposed to embrace it all so that we can protect rights of everyone, because everyone in the community deserves dignity and respect. I pass on to the next person. I'll be willing to respond to any question that they have there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johnson. Johnson really has played a heroic role in Uganda in putting information out bravely and objectively. And I'm struck by the way, Johnson, you picked up on the concept of the double-edged sword. And something I'm interested in exploring when we come around to the group discussion is why this reporting might be a double-edged sword, both for the LGBTQ plus community, but also for the reporter themselves, in terms of the reporter's status, positively and negatively. I thought that was very interesting. I'm going to move on to Nikita Maisela now. Nikita is a South African freelance journalist who started her journey of telling stories from the LGBTIQ community just over a year ago at City Press, which is one of South Africa's largest newspapers, a Sunday newspaper, traditionally aimed at Black readers. She has completed her bachelor's degree at the University of Cape Town in politics and economic history with courses in gender studies. Nikita, I'd like you to tell us a bit about the experience of writing about LGBTQ issues for a mainstream newspaper in the South African context? Over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Let me just get this up. There we go. So as Mark mentioned, my name is Nikita Maisela. My pronouns are she, her, and my position at City Press was a collaboration with an organization called the Other Foundation, which is an African trust dedicated to advancing human rights in Southern Africa, with a particular focus on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people. So essentially, I had the opportunity to share and echo queer stories, not only from South Africa, but the Southern African region, which left me with the task of figuring out how to mainstream narratives that involve experiences and language that many people in the newsroom, like some of my editors, and the readership, who are made up of so many different people from our society, who essentially were not very familiar with concepts and realities like gender diversity, sexuality that is outside of heteronormative perspectives. And as much as the focus was to tell human stories in my role, it also became an opportunity and my mission to work towards creating more inclusive and affirming ways to tell stories in mainstream media. I had an emphasis in my own writing to collaborate with the people whose stories are being told, which sometimes meant that I was walking on a fine line between balancing my activism with my reporting. I think some challenges faced included having to be hyper aware of othering language when talking about queer people and the community. It's something that comes up particularly in headlines, article blurbs, and if it's not caught early enough, I think it can be deeply problematic. But it also speaks to how the story is being told, which needs to be paid a lot of attention to. We're sharing about people's lives who have been criminalized, stigmatized, and ostracized. When I'm sharing people's life stories, it's a relationship of trust that allowed me the opportunity to do that. So I really am dropping the ball, which I have experienced a few times when I leave my story once I've written it and just leave it to go off into editing. Because I'm working in print, right? So the story is traveling to different people in different sections for it to become print ready. And most likely it's not going to be handled with an eye that is conscious of things that I have been conscious of, and the negative effect of which, for example, incorrect pronouns or othering language can have on a community at large is extensive and can be violent and can perpetuate harmful stereotypes. I had some support in the newsroom, which allowed me to follow the stories through to print, which really helped in getting the word out in a positive and empowering way, I would say. I think another challenge would be when it comes to telling stories that aren't necessarily landmark ruling cases regarding queer community and human rights. I found myself having to work at justifying why certain issues people were facing in their lives was in fact an issue that should be spoken about. And that's something I found to be quite difficult because as an activist and a member of the queer community, I was having to take my human self out of my own experiences and convince someone that this reality one human being is facing is also a reality that other human beings, part of this community, have also faced, and that it's a story to be told. Also doing this justification with limited data, right? Because a lot of the times, for example, statistics about discrimination experienced by trans women and gender nonconforming persons in formal workplaces is not something you're going to find so easily. You're sometimes working with an individual source's story. So finding connections to everyday people that read the paper was important, which I was able to do. And I'll talk about that a bit later as the discussion progresses. But transforming mindsets and socialized perceptions of how things are supposed to be is something I believe traditional media can play a big role in to reach masses. It's something I'm honored to contribute to. And yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be part of this discussion today. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, Nikita. I want to follow that up with a couple of quick questions. You spoke about the difficulty or the challenge of balancing advocacy and reporting, and of having the job of reporting on a community of which you are also part, and a community that has been marginalized and is often vulnerable. Can you say a little bit more about that and how you found that balance, or how you find that balance?
Well, I think that the reality is that the everyday space that I'm in is a newsroom. And a lot of the times, I think it was easy for me to feel quite isolated because I was essentially the only person who was specifically telling stories from the queer community. And my position was a collaboration with a client, right, the other foundation. So finding the balance came from realizing the heaviness of telling someone's story in a mainstream platform or mainstream space that a lot of the times people don't trust the media. A lot of the times people aren't, based on trauma and experiences that they've had, journalists or people telling their stories have misrepresented them or written about them in, like I had mentioned earlier, an othering way. So I think a lot of that burden being carried by me really allowed me to take on different perspectives. One of them being, okay, I'm in a newsroom every day. This is my 9 to 5. I'm engaging with journalists who potentially don't know a lot of the concepts that I'm dealing with and that I'm engaging with. How do I get help from that? So having to seek information from other people and in that educating them and in that learning more about what it is that my journalistic integrity is and where it stems from really allowed for the opportunity for me to take a step back and see, okay, I'm an activist, I have my activist voice, but I also have this other thing to uphold, which is telling accurate stories in the best and most humane way. And I think that opportunity to just take a step back outside of it really allowed me to see, oh, okay, am I just being loud and shouting about this issue? Or am I, trying to share information from outside of the community that I'm in, which is the whole point of using mainstream media for that.
Well, thank you very much. There's something else you spoke about that I want to flag for later discussion, which is, as you mentioned, that it was collaboration with a client, the other foundation. And what's happened in many parts of the continent, certainly in Uganda too, Johnson, is that objective and fair LGBT reporting on LGBTQ issues and people is often funded. It's often funded by donors, by foreign donors, and this has the other foundation isn't necessarily a foreign donor, but this dynamic can play into the hands of those who say that the gay issue is a foreign issue that's being imposed upon Africans. And I'm interested to know how one negotiates that possibility. We can come back to that, Nikita. Right now, I want to move on to Vincent Desmond, who's an award-winning writer and journalist covering culture and identity in Nigeria, and who's reported for and contributed to global titles like Dazed, ID, Vice, Paper, Nylon, Mail and Guardian, Reuters, and so many more. What's really interesting to me about Vincent's career is how he has also written as an art queer reporter himself for Nigerian titles such as Why Niger. And I'm really interested to hear from you, Vincent, about the effect in Nigeria of the very strong anti-LGBTQ legislation on what is happening right now around this in Nigeria, on how this affects your own ability to publish and your own identity as a Nigerian, as a journalist, as a queer person. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Vincent Desmond. My pronouns are he, him. I actually fell into LGBTQ reporting, actually by, I wouldn't say mistake, but more of like passion. I actually came from a fashion and lifestyle background in media, but then there were a lot of personal experiences and experiences in my own community that I felt this need to report on. And when working with newsrooms in Nigeria, you often get a lot of pushback when you want to report on queer stories, on stories that involve the LGBTQ community. So initially, a lot of my work that focused on LGBTQ issues were independently published, Medium, personal articles, and stuff like that, because you just not get it just won't get greenlit. But then there are a lot of like say newer publications, a lot more youth-run publications that are considerably more progressive, that are more willing to take on chances. But even in these publications, you still get a lot of pushback. You still get a lot of, there's this desire to, like say, sensationalize queer lives and queer issues. And you have to be careful when doing that because you're reporting on people who have been demonized by this media already, and you cannot add to that demonization, especially as a queer person, as an out queer person. There is responsibility that you just have to your own community. So reporting as a queer person kind of places this responsibility on me because I have access to the community. So when I interview people, they're often hesitant, but they're like, because you're a queer person, I will let you interview me and I'll let you tell the story. So I have to make sure, like what Nikita said about keeping like being very on board with the whole process right till it gets down. You need to do that. You need to make sure from the titles, from the blogs to everything, because at any step, at any point in time, it could be changed. It could be you write an amazing story that humanizes a character, that humanizes the community, and once you have the result, is something that demonizes everyone, and then you are now the person whose byline is there. You are now the person who has betrayed your community. So reporting when reporting as a queer writer in Nigeria, you kind of you're reporting at intersection as someone who is Nigerian, who understands the drawback of reporting for Nigerian publications. You're a journalist who has a responsibility to tell stories, but you at the same time you're also like a queer person who owes his community, who has to make sure he does not pile on the demonization of like the Nigerian queer community in media. Because if you take a look back at the Nigerian history, Nigerian queer history when it comes to the media. The media played a very significant, probably one of the most significant roles in the passing of the SSMPA, the law that criminalizes homosexuality in Nigeria. Around that time, you got a lot of reports, a lot of things that justify, that give reason, that give backing to this law. So when you report, you're reporting all of this history, you're reporting all of this knowledge, and you're reporting all of this responsibility. So I won't say tricky, but it's an interesting position to be in. It's a very interesting position to be in. But the good thing about Nigeria at the moment is that we are witnessing this, like say, shift, this demographic shift, because there are more, according to statistics, we have like 60% of Nigerians between 25 and 18. And this particular age group have shown to be considerably more progressive than the previous generation. Obviously not progressive enough, but we've gone from, let's say, according to the tiers research, we had like 75% of Nigerians were violently homophobic as of 2018. 2019, we're down to like 50%. So it's not good. It's not what we want, but it's progress. So now, when you have these youthful people, these young people in general publications like Zikoko, Native, all these young publications, you now have stories that humanize queer people. You now have stories that actually care about these people they're writing about and don't want to pile on the hate. So it's an exciting time, for one, but it's also a very heavy, like say, like very short time. Like there's so much tension. There's so much you have to be careful. There's so much you have to just, because cancel culture is like at an all-time high and everything. So it's a very interesting position to be in. Yeah.
Thank you, Vincent. I want to follow that up with a question about why you think younger Nigerians are more progressive. And do you think it's because of, I mean, we've been speaking about African media, right? And particularly national media, the Ugandan media, the South African media, the Nigerian media. But we have to acknowledge as well that media consumers in this digital age consume global media too. And perhaps nowhere more so than Nigeria, where every Nigerian has 2 or 3 cell phones and is sort of wired in many ways to global currents. So I'm interested to hear from you what the dynamic is between the consuming of as you say, a homophobic national media that might actually be building support for the anti-homosexuality legislation, and a global media that might give a different message, and whether you think that has had an effect on younger Nigerians in terms of changing attitudes, what the positive and negative effects are of being sort of globally wired for Africans in Nigeria and elsewhere.
So here's the thing, because of the internet, because of social media and digitalization of everything, the young Nigerians are more connected than the previous generations were. So we are connected to all of these stories. We are forced to garner empathy because everyone now understands things on a better level. There's so many stories out there. There's so much about queer people, so much about LGBTQ people. So it's a lot of Nigerians, even the ones that are homophobic in a less violent way, if that makes sense. They're homophobic in a, well, you know, it's fine. I'll just leave queer people alone, which is like significantly different from what was like on ground, let's say 5-10 years ago, where we had people burning like queer people down just because they suspected that they were queer. So it's not good, but it's definitely like a noticeable shift, a distinction between this generation and the generation that came before it. So that media, the negative part of that is that because of how connected we are, there are a number of us that tend to forget that we still exist in a very homophobic place. We still exist in a very, we still exist in Nigeria, because there are, when you spend how many hours a day in your looking at your screen, how many hours a day tweeting, how many hours on Instagram, you at some point you're connected to this global community, but you're still here, you're still in Nigeria, and there's that. If you take time to observe the queer community, you would watch certain moments where we, well, I say, take on global queer issues, and we tend to forget that we also have our own local queer issues. We also forget that we have this law. Because I have spoken with several people who genuinely believe that the law was just no longer effective, because you have so many people that are out on social media, you have some people that are out in real life, but just because they have taken on this, like, Americanized, in quotes, view of politics and of reality. So it has its drawbacks. I would say that the positive outweighs the negative, because that has given us like this kind of boldness. Like there's a video that's going viral now of someone walking down the street shouting queer lives matter in Nigeria. So we have all of these good moments that are coming out of this dissertation, this connection to the global community, but we also have individual personal drawback in the community where people tend to forget or get in over their head, like the global community, if that makes sense.
Thank you. That's a really critical point, and I'm grateful to you for having made it. I'm going to move on to Kevin Mwachiro now. Kevin is a writer, podcaster, journalist, and queer activist based in Kenya. He's also a former BBC journalist. He wrote a book, Invisible: Queer Stories from Kenya, which was published in 2014 and which was a pathbreaker in East Africa. He is also a co-founder of the Art Film Festival, East Africa's first LGBTQ film festival. Kevin, I'd be interested to hear you talk about the way the media has covered the issue, particularly recent court cases around the decriminalization of sodomy in Kenya, and whether the discourse has changed. Also, because of your status as an activist yourself, I'm interested in hearing about your experiences working on the other side with your advocacy hat on in trying to sensitize the media. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody. My pronouns are he, him. It's interesting that you started with Johnson talking about David Kato's death, and I just wanted to bring that into my own experience and as I respond to your questions. And one of the hardest stories I had to cover was the death of David Kato. I was the correspondent on duty that afternoon when I was still working with the BBC in Nairobi. My emotions were all over the place soon after I'd heard the news. There was shock and sadness. We weren't friends, but we knew of one another and attended a number of meetings together during the formative years of the LGBTQ movement here in East Africa. However, that afternoon, I made sure that my coverage of his death was going to honor his memory and the work that he had done for our rights in this region. I remember after doing one radio interview, I had a moment to myself in the studio and I cried. I had to give myself that time to grieve, for one of our soldiers had gone. The challenge in covering the story was getting the truth out there of what really happened. And it happened at a time where things were really emotive in Uganda around LGBTQ rights. David Kato was a personality whose passing needed to be covered with dignity and not sensationalism that often surrounds our daily lives and even our deaths. I hope that day I did him proud. I want to quote something from Chinua Achebe, and in one of his essays titled Spelling Our Proper Name, he says, the telling of the story of Black, and you can also insert LGBTQ people in our time, for a considerable period has been the self-appointed responsibility of white, also insert patriarchy, right-wingers, or moralists. and they have done it to suit their own purpose. Naturally, that must change and is slowly beginning to change, but not without resistance or hostility. So much psychological, political, economic interests are vested in making sure that our image still remains negative. The reason is simple. If you're going to enslave or colonize somebody, you're not going to write a glowing report about either him before or after. Rather, you will uncover or invent terrible stories about him so that that act of brindage become easy for you to live with. Moving on to this other side, as an activist, we've tried with a lot of the communities, organizations here in Kenya to sensitize the media. We've organized training sessions with them. We've given them booklets that have information of our terms, how to call us, how to describe who we are, our sex, our gender identity, or our orientation. We've had a number of those training sessions. Even last year, with the coverage of our case, Repeal 162, there was a concerted effort to make sure that all the information, right information, got out there. But there were still mistakes in the coverage of that landmark case, even though we lost. In my work as a journalist, I tried to make sure that I was also introducing other activists into the newsroom so that we could slowly change our narrative and have our stories told the way they should be rather. Coverage in this region, and I say in Kenya, is far from perfect. It is changing slowly, but our narratives are slowly being changed to the way that we wanted to. It was only last week, there was a story in the Standard that talked about the extortion cases, the blackmail cases. There is a ring that is prevalent in Nairobi, and how people's lives are being put at risk by this dragnet. And it was really interesting to see that this story was making this story on an issue that is affecting us was actually covered almost justly within the press. We're getting there, Mark. And for me, my role as an activist on this side is to make sure that I am visible. As an activist, I am visible. My work is visible. That is through the podcast. I'm just making sure that I'm available as a pundit so that people can get to hear the story the way we want to tell. And I think it is important to be able to break into those newsrooms, not just with the work that Johnson is doing, Nikita and Vincent are doing, but also to break in as subjects and as individuals who are on the other side. I'm using my profile to tell our story for those who can't tell their story yet. I'm using my profile to tell the story so that others can also tell our story so that others can also take it, so that others can also walk into those newsrooms with their heads held up high. That's what I'm doing. That's my form of activism in trying to make a change in Kenya.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I have a couple of follow-up questions. Before I ask them, I want to encourage those on this webinar to submit your own questions because we have 20 minutes left for discussion and we'd love to hear your concerns and your specific questions to these panelists. It's a quite unprecedented opportunity to speak frankly among colleagues because there are many journalists on this webinar too about how to go about dealing with the issues we've all discussed today. Please feel free to send your questions in as soon as possible. Kevin, you spoke about the importance of breaking in as subjects. So not just particularly if you're an LGBTQ activist or a queer activist, not just telling other people's stories, but acknowledging that other people might not be able to tell their stories, and writing in the subjective or podcasting in the subjective, and telling one's own story using the I, which, as we know, is a controversial but very important part of journalism, whether it be narrative long-form journalism or the kind of podcast essay that's becoming more and more popular. I want to ask you first, Kevin, but then everybody else on this call, about how you use the I. whether you identify as LGBTQ yourself or as an ally, what it has meant to speak personally about this issue for you, professionally and personally, the double-edged sword that Johnson spoke about. And let's start with you, and then I'm going to throw this open to everybody.
Thanks, Mark. I think for me, when Kenyan media started covering LGBTQ issues, there was a stereotype of the type of queer individuals that they got onto the stories. You know, a good number of them were from the coast here of Kenya, where some were even sex workers. And when I worked at the BBC, and it used to irk me. I'm like, that's not all who we are. You know, there were professionals who figured our voices and our faces were missing. And for me, it is important, especially even now as an older gay man, you know, it is important to show people that there is continuity. There is continuity. It is possible to grow as professionally. It isn't impossible to grow and dream as an openly queer person here in Africa, because we don't get to see our faces as often. They're younger, but there are lots of us who still need to be seen. And I think because in our activist circles, we hear of individuals who, when they get to their 40s, go back into the closet because of social pressure. You know, they're alone. You know, either gone back to the rural village, and church and social fabric is a lot stronger there. And people don't see other faces. They don't hear other voices of what it is like to be gay and after 40. You know, and for me, that is important to show that there is projection, there is longevity to our lives and to our stories. And it also helps in our narrative, in breaking that narrative that the queer movement or queer organizing only began in Africa in the late noughties, but it was there before. And for me, that I find that really exciting, and I'm really I want to hear more of those stories of queer Africans who are above 40, above 50, just to show that this is where we came from, and it is possible to exist as a queer person in Africa.
Thank you, Kevin. Would anybody else like to address that question? Johnson, Nikita, Vincent. Don't go for it, Nikita.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. I think for me, what I was able to do at City Press is to utilize the different sections of the paper, and particularly the section that I enjoyed was the arts section, or writing about art, and using, the section is called trending. And what I was able to do with that, which I found very empowering for someone who is part of the community and who is trying to use this activist voice in mainstream media, was really reflecting queer identities outside of the trope of homophobic Africa and struggle, which is part of the experiences, but it's not in entirety, right? And being able to do that through writing about art and music and culture that is about queer lives, amplifying queer voices and activism, was something that I found to be very empowering for myself and fellow cadres in the community. And also just being able to have these stories about groups of people who are considered minorities, groups of people who experience a lot of violence and trauma in this, I guess, very patriarchal, heteronormative world, and having these stories reach people outside of our communities, because we're talking about the young Black artist, the young Black musician, the young Black poet. Look at this book that was written, look at this album that was released, and really highlighting it and framing it in a celebratory way, in a way that's like, look, these people are making a mark, they're creating work that's going to be part of history books for younger people that are following them, and they're doing something that they're told they're not supposed to do. I think that, yeah, that was really important, and a really powerful way to say, look at who is part of the human race, look who's part of our society. Yes, there are differences based on sexuality or gender diversity, but that doesn't mean that these people mean anything less, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Nikita. Johnson, Vincent, anything to add?
Thank you, Mark, for the question. To add on what Kevin and Nikita have said, using the I is important. But the reason why I said we need to have a change in the editorial policies and maybe the existing laws to influence further attitudes within our communities. during the course of my work, I have interacted even with members of the community within the newsroom, but they are not willing to come out and say, I am. Why? Because they are protecting the job. The policies that are in place say, once you're found, you exit, you're expelled. So in a way to keep a job in a place that is so competitive to get another job once you lose one, they prefer to step back and stay in the closet just to keep the life going. But as I publish the stories, even as there are those that come and say, why are you sticking on this story? And there are other better stories to publish, or why are you promoting them? Those that are within the community will come and tell you, man, you're doing a good job, keep it on. We can't come out, but we are supporting you. So the faces are there within, but the policies that are in place are not favorable enough to allow these people to come out, so that even those within the newsroom get to know that there are other people even among us who are part of the community. But to let the editors know that we are not talking about something, that a concept that is usually portrayed as quite agenda. I've ensured that I let the activists and members within the community who are willing to meet other journalists and interact with them. Like, I've connected them to other journalists so that they get to know them and interact with them, even if it's not just for the story, but just to get to know that we are talking about human lives that are existent. We're not just talking about things that are just made up. So I think, like I've said, there's still more that needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnson. Vincent, would you like to address that question at all?
Hi, everyone. So when it comes to using the AI in writing stories about the LGBT community, I think it's very important. I think it's very empowering to insert yourself in all of these narratives and in all of the stories that you tell. But I think it's also very important to ensure that when you insert yourself, you're doing so in your own stories. You're doing so in a way that doesn't, well, I say, nullify or contradict someone else's experience or stories. Because when there are times I write stories and maybe I've used my access as a member of the queer community to get certain stories, certain various stories, that are not like my own experiences as a queer person. I distance myself from the I distance myself from the stories that I'm writing. I do not insert myself. I make sure I am just a writer. I'm just a reporter. I am not in the story. And then when I tell stories that I'm inserting myself in, I'm sure this is my experience that I am doubling down on, that I am telling people that this happened. I saw this happen, this happened to me, or this is what I feel. So this is me in this story. This is me telling you my own experience and not nullifying or contradicting someone else's experience in the story that I'm telling. So I think it's very important, because I do think both parts are very important in reporting on LGBTQ culture, especially in Africa, especially in places like Nigeria. And I think it's very important people are careful when inserting themselves in stories without undoing the great work that they've already done in such stories.
Thank you very much, Vincent. We have a question from Paula Frey. And her question is, what immediate steps can newsroom managers take to improve coverage of LGBTI plus issues? And I want to fold into that another question of my own that comes out of Nikita's observation about the complexity of making sure that everybody in the chain down to the sub-editors gets all the terminology right. How does one deal with the fact of an ever-shifting terminology? Those of you on this webinar would have heard us use the word LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQI, queer. It's complicated for somebody who doesn't know the terrain. But answer that question within the bigger question: what immediate steps can newsroom managers take to improve coverage of LGBTI issues? Johnson, would you like to address that first? And then, since you have been a newsroom manager yourself, and then we can ask everybody else to chip in too.
Thank you. One of the challenges I faced when I started reporting issues, when I started writing stories of sexual minorities, was to deal with understanding of the terminologies that were really needed. But I interacted, but within reporting, I got a chance to interact with the activists within the community who would come and give me feedback and tell me this was misrepresented, this wasn't written well. So in that way, I kept on improving myself. All the time, I got onto the desk of to be part of the editorial team. So in a way, it helped in putting out the stories about the community, because any story that concerns the community, if I had not written it also, and there's someone that has written it, at least I always tell the editors that please let it come through me so that I can make sure that whatever is going out is not misrepresenting or misgendering anyone or is homophobic, just to ensure that what is told is accurate and conforms to the standards of the journalism profession, and not just promoting sensationalism and things that would further promote homophobia within the community. Thank you.
Would anybody else like to address the question about steps newsroom managers can take to improve coverage of LGBTI issues? Go for it, Kevin.
I think it's important to write terms like this into editorial policies, into guidelines, newsroom guidelines. You know, the language. If we do it for all other things, why not also include this? We used to have an editorial booklet at the BBC. I think if we are able to put that into guidelines that manage our newsrooms, that is the step, so that everybody is reading from the same script. For me, it just goes back to getting the basics right. You know, and we do that in terms of all other languages. So why do we make it sound like it's difficult? It's harder when it comes to talking about LGBTQ matters.
Mark.
Yes.
If I may add on Kevin's point, I've taken interest in getting more knowledge and learning. Like last year, I attended a training with Thomas Reuters about reporting LGBTQI issues. We're also given a booklet. So when I returned, I shared the same booklet with other editors, so that if in case I'm not around, they can use it, refer to it. But like I have said, the attitudes still don't match the standards. So you find that they just push the story through without even cross-checking what is required of them. So the change in attitudes and policies and things like that, we still need work to do around them. Thank you.
Vincent, did you want to respond?
I think another thing that is extremely important is for editors and sub-editors to not assume, especially when they're working in very specific places. Because I've worked with editors that are based in the US and in the UK, and while the process of editing, they take out certain bits, certain pieces that are very crucial to the pieces, that are very crucial in the Nigerian context. And even like I have instances where I'm trying to correct or point out that, you know, maybe in the US LGBT community, this does not mean much, but in the Nigerian community actually means a lot. It implies a whole lot of different stories. I think there's that bit where people do need to understand that when working in certain communities, certain contexts, you need to also like never assume that it's a universal law. It just works everywhere the same thing. And when working with people that are from these places, you should consider listening to those people and not just assume that you do know better, even though maybe you might outrank them or something like that.
Thank you. Nikita, would you like to add anything, having worked in a newsroom yourself?
Yeah, just a quick one. I do think that, or not think, it's a fact, there are a lot of, I guess, queer organizations, LGBTI advocacy organizations who work a lot around sensitization workshops with the media. And I think that in a lot of our countries, that is a reality that newsroom managers are faced with and can engage with. So I think an emphasis on collaboration with people who are on the ground and doing activist work and who are, you know, pretty knowledgeable and engaged with what it is that their issues are with media reporting on their experiences and the experience of the community is a way that managers can get the tools to report in a more just way, and also acknowledging when you don't know enough and that there is someone else out there who does know more is a starting point, I feel.
We have a question from Emma Eastwood of the Human Dignity Trust in London. And I actually think it's a fine question to conclude on. So perhaps make your concluding remarks in response to this question, but anything else you'd like to come back to that has been fired in you from listening to each other in your final comments. The question is, we've all answered this a little bit in our presentations, but perhaps let's bring it together to some kind of conclusion. The question is, as journalists and activists in your countries, in order to build tolerance and hopefully acceptance for LGBT people, what strategies do you employ when you are reporting on LGBT lives? I know you might have answered this in bits and pieces up to now, but perhaps in conclusion, let's go around the room, starting with you, Johnson, in a final comment or statement.
Thank you, Mark. To report better, I've immersed myself in the community to get to understand everyone, get to understand the terminologies, get to understand the daily lives of sexual minorities within the community. It's important to be within, to be part of the community other than being out and report from outside. It doesn't help. You have to get in, make friends within the community. If you're not part of the community, make friends within the community so that you can be able to so that you get the correct information that is necessary to write a story that is worth reporting, not just promoting sensationalism and homophobia within the country or within the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikita. Nikita, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was just saying that in my experience, read the strategy point, I looked for elements and I guess discussion topics or spaces that I knew would interest the paper's readers as well as the editors, of course. And I took that as an opportunity to link human experience stories about human beings first and foremost. But in that, my focus was on human beings whose stories are different because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. So if I can give an example, I think religion is a really powerful and nuanced point across the continent, not just in South Africa or Southern Africa. And yeah, particularly my paper was always drawn towards stories about religion, which allowed me to have discussions and open up the discussions about religious leaders who are considered as progressive or people who, you know, went away from faith and now they've come back. And it's just, there's so much in that realm that can attract so many people outside of the community and inside the community to have a discussion, and also being able to make that discussion fully rounded or as rounded as it can be with different multiple voices involved was something that worked in terms of telling a human story that isn't villainizing a queer person and is kind of creating that connection, right, between something that is widely believed in our country, which would be faith.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nikita. Vincent.
I think one of the biggest traits that is needed for responsible reporting of LGBTQ people, especially in Africa, is like you approach the stories knowing fully whether these people are actually humans. You approach the story tenderly. You approach the story as like you deal with actual individuals, but of a whole community. You don't just write a story about, let's say, a gay man and just all you forgot on it is a gay man. You and then you end up wiping out his whole humanity, the entirety of his story. When writing stories, it's very important that you understand that you're not just coming at it as a whole community. You're actually interviewing, you're talking about particular people. You're talking about individuals with life, individuals with past and present. As much as possible, it's very important to report responsibly, knowing fully well that this person is not the gay community. This woman is not the lesbian community. This is an individual in the community. And it's very important to not just use their sexuality to wipe everything out. This is especially true when you're reporting on a story in places like Nigeria, where the media has already villainized the LGBT community too, as a whole. So when you say this person was a gay man, the whole context automatically becomes bad. The person is painted as a bad person. So you do need to go further I won't say explain, but you need to go further to paint this person as a human being who just happens to be gay, as a gay man. But when you do so in places like Nigeria, with the context and what is implied is that this is already a bad story, especially to the Nigerian audience. So I think when reporting story, that's like the very first step that needs to be taken to ensure responsible reporting is approach this story tenderly, approach this story with some humanity, approach this story knowing you're reporting on actual people, actual lives, actual past, actual present, actual future. Approach the story knowing that this is someone who has a job, someone who has a life, not just someone whose entirety begins and ends with their being gay, bisexual, or whatever in the community. I think that is probably the very first step that any editor, sub-editor, or anyone leading a newsroom should take when they're reporting.
Thank you, Vincent. Over to you, Kevin.
I think for me, it's important that we also, as activists, push our stories, tell our narratives the way we want to be told. I've worked with a few online publications who are open to hearing content from us. So for me, it's a question of, and they've given us the liberty to write our stories using journalistic standards. And some newsrooms, unfortunately, may not have the most active journalists and will cut and paste a story into the press. So let's just take advantage of that as activists and push our stories, normalize like what Vincent has said and Nikita, let us normalize our stories, push our stories into the newsrooms as citizens of our respective countries, and let's draw similarities. I think that's how we start breaking in.
Kevin, I think you raise a really key challenge. Kevin, Vincent, Nikita, Johnson, when you speak about normalizing our stories, because really one of the reasons in the last decade or a little bit more that there's been so much negative publicity in African media, and Johnson gave a very strong example of this when he showed us that Rolling Stone cover, but we could look at Nigeria, we could look at Malawi, we could look at Senegal, is that this story is seen as abnormal and sensational. And that's what attracts the attention of the newsroom to a story. In Malawi, very famously, two men marry, and there's a big headline that says gays engage, because this is going to sell newspapers. There's a kind of sensationalist demonization that happens that triggers a moral panic that has terrible impact on people's lives. The publishing of people's names in Nigeria after a raid on a hotel, the publishing of those 100 people in Uganda that led in one way or another to David Kato's death. I think what you've all given us in ways that I found incredibly encouraging and helpful are strategies for writing about LGBTQ issues and people, for bringing into the open the lives and experiences of people who have always been part of African society, but invisible and hidden, bringing them to light in a way that is done so with respect, with dignity, and with the aim not of selling newspapers or sensationalizing, but of helping readers and listeners understand the complexity, the diversity, the hybridity of African lives in countries where there is, and in societies and in media environments where there is too often only one way that one can be African or Nigerian or Ugandan or South African. So thank you very much, all of you, for helping understand this better. And I really do hope that for those of you who are on this webinar, you have some ideas, you have some strategies. If you're a young queer journalist yourself, that you've been given some courage or some thoughts about how you might advance your career, please feel free to contact any of us individually. You'll find us all online through one or other social media platform if you have follow-up questions or thoughts. And thank you very much once more for joining us. For those of you who are remaining in the conference, the next session, starting in 25 minutes time at 3:30 South African time, is the training session on case studies uncovering COVID-19 disinformation. Once more, thanks very much to all of you for joining us, and to the AIJC for hosting this really important conversation. Have a wonderful afternoon.